So before you click off of this video assuming it's just clickbait, I'm going to tell you the very interesting story about how the thylacine, aka the Tasmanian tiger, might have at some point made it to the wilds of the United States and actually became established as a potential invasive species, at least for some time. Yes, I know this sounds absolutely crazy, but there's actually some evidence behind this theory, and while most of the stuff we're going to be going over today cannot be confirmed with 100% certainty, I feel like this topic is so interesting it just has to be discussed. So how would a Tasmanian tiger make it halfway across the world all the way up to the northeastern United States? Well, you see, this wild story all starts back in 1902 with the Bronx Zoo. As people in Tasmania slowly realized that the Tasmanian tiger, aka the thylacine, was slowly getting rarer and rarer, its demand in zoos across the country became more and more popular, and eventually the United States wanted to capitalize off of this incredibly unique and rare animal. So what they decided to do was ship out some thylacines from Tasmania all the way to the United States. The result was one male individual being shipped all the way to New York, and another female individual with some pups being shipped over to Washington, D.C. While unfortunately all the pups being shipped to Washington, D.C. would die shortly after being shipped out, mainly due to the very subpar conditions that pretty much every thylacine was kept in while being shipped to the U.S., the female did survive and was displayed at the National Zoo in Washington. The male also survived and was eventually displayed in the Bronx Zoo shortly after being shipped out. Why they didn't put these two thylacine together is beyond my guess, probably just because the zoos wanted to profit off of each individual thylacine separately and cared more about the profits than the actual species, which is a real shame, as back then zoos were way more about entertainment than conservation. The fact that the Bronx Zoo would literally display Oda, a literal human child, only shortly after displaying its first thylacine is very much proof of this. For Christ's sake, they literally kept him next to the orangutan exhibit. But getting back on track and talking about the equally sad thylacine story, on top of the zoos not really caring about ethics that much, they didn't exactly care about putting the thylacines in beautiful or pristine enclosures, like what we see with the Bronx Zoo with living animals today. Both thylacine would end up being kept in subpar cages with complete isolation and no enrichment, only being fed a rabbit every so often, which isn't even their natural prey. Because of this, naturally, both thylacines would die only a few years after being kept in captivity, and this would lead to what could eventually be summed up as the thylacine race. With the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. and the Bronx Zoo in New York City being the only two zoos in the United States having thylacine, they basically had a race with each other to see how many thylacine they could collect and replace, while also attempting to display them off to the public at the same time. In total, after both initial thylacine's deaths in 1904 and 1908 respectively, the race would begin, having a total of 11 adult thylacine brought to both zoos. But this is where things get really interesting, because not every thylacine would make it to its respective zoo. While there isn't that much documentation of this event, between the years of 1916 and 1917, a cargo boat crash would occur carrying a bunch of animals to the Bronx Zoo, including at least one pair of thylacine. While I've heard some claims saying that it was actually two pairs of mating thylacine, there's incredibly little information on this event, and the little information I was able to find upon it seemed to support the idea of there just being one breeding pair of thylacine and not two. Yet again, since this event occurred over 100 years ago, it's very possible that there could have been two pairs of mating thylacine and just that it wasn't that well documented. So did the thylacines actually die in the boat crash? Well, you see, this is where things get a bit more speculative, as no bodies of any thylacine were recovered. And also we know for a fact that multiple of the other animals that did survive the boat crash ended up escaping into the New England wilderness, where they had to be recaptured. So we know that there is a chance that these thylacine could have survived if these other animals did as well. And while the Bronx Zoo would end up labeling every animal that wasn't recaptured as simply having died in transit, there's a very good chance that some of these animals that weren't found, including possibly maybe the Tasmanian tigers, at least for some time. I'm not saying by any means do I believe that they're still around today, as while that's not impossible, that is highly unlikely. At least in North America, that is. And yes, I'll bring up sightings in other places around the world later in the video, but right now we're focusing on the US. Which, by the way, I should specify, the cargo crash that would occur, which could have possibly released at least a few thylacine, would end up occurring in the New England area. The New England area includes Vermont, New Hampshire, and everyone's favorite, Massachusetts. And while certainly not identical, the climate was fairly similar to that of Tasmania, so that raises the question, could a thylacine even survive in New England? Well, maybe. You see, despite its name, the Tasmanian tiger once didn't just inhabit Tasmania. At one point, they inhabited the entire Australian continent and all of New Guinea. In other words, this animal was incredibly adaptable and was a very successful predator. At least until it would go extinct, or at the very least incredibly rare on the mainland due to the introduction of dingoes, which would end up eventually outcompeting the thylacine. But before we get to the problem of competition, would the thylacine even be able to survive the weather experienced in New England? Well, it's hard to say for sure, as while the thylacine is extremely adaptable, it also did not experience any of the extreme seasonal changes that would be experienced in New England in its prior range, as New England has much cooler winters with snow being way more common, and also much warmer summers with heat waves being quite common, so if the thylacine could adapt to that is really up to your own interpretation. But putting that aside, assuming that the thylacines that did escape would have been able to adapt to the more extreme seasonal temperature changes, what else would possibly be stopping the thylacine from becoming established, or at the very least being able to survive in New England for a few extra years? Well, that's when you realize we need to talk about the other elephant in the room, that being the other wildlife that would have inhabited New England at the time. Despite the nickname striped wolf or Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine is actually a marsupial. In fact, it was actually the largest carnivorous marsupial to make it long enough to exist in documented time. And they also specialized in eating other marsupials. And you see, New England doesn't exactly have that many marsupials, with the only marsupial around being the opossum. Every other mammal in New England is essentially placental, and it's hard to say for sure if placental mammals would contain the same sort of necessary vitamins and nutrients that the thylacine would need, as in captivity, while they did entirely feed on placental mammals, such as the rodents they were regularly fed, it's hard to say if this diet actually contributed to a lot of the captive thylacine's early deaths or not, as it simply isn't the food they're adapted to digesting. Though at the same time, it's also hard to say if marsupial meat content would really be that different, if at all, to placental mammal meat. Really, it's hard to say for sure, as far as we know, the thylacine is extinct. But there is one other limiting factor that would make it a challenge for the thylacine to become permanently established in New England, that being the competition. You see, New England was home to gray wolves, particularly the eastern gray wolf. But if you didn't pick up on it yet, I just said was, as the eastern gray wolf would actually go extinct before the 1900s, when the thylacine would have arrived. This would mean the only other competitors they'd have to deal with would be black bears, which while unfamiliar to them would likely leave the thylacines alone, and the coyotes, which wouldn't actually arrive in New England and become established until 1950, meaning that the Tasmanian tiger would have a 30-year window for themselves to become possibly established and actually not have to worry about competition too much. Odds are similar to what happened in Australia with the dingoes, though the thylacines would eventually have had gone extinct anyway in New England due to the introduction of coyotes. So yes, while unlikely, the thylacine could have definitely survived in New England, at least for a little while, assuming both individuals made it off the island and continued breeding, as they were allegedly a mating pair. So is there any evidence for them actually having survived the boat crash? Well, yes, there actually is. You see, shortly after the boat initially crashed, there was a ton of sightings of alleged chupacabras in the area. And what animal better fits the description of the chupacabra, from the noise it would have made to its incredibly long tail and weird-looking dog-like appearance, than of course everyone's favorite extinct animal, the thylacine. And while it is incredibly hard to confirm first-hand accounts and photos like these, which are most likely faked, these accounts and photos do exist, and I think that is enough to at the very least be considered worth looking into. And while photos like these, both in the US and Tasmania, clearly show a fox with mange, which could be mistaken for the thylacine or a chupacabra very easily, you can tell the difference by the placement of the heel and the flexibility of the tail, as foxes have much more flexible tails and a heel placement much higher up than that of the thylacine. Also, foxes with mange just look way more unhealthy and way less adorable than, well, this. And it should be kept in mind that there is a very likely chance that these alleged chupacabra sightings are not thylacine, but simply just foxes with mange, or even coyotes that came over to New England early and stayed till the modern day, which happen to carry mange. Really though, with how little information can be found on this subject, we'll probably never know for sure if there was ever at any point any wild thylacine surviving, let alone breeding in the United States. And based on what we've seen in Australia, odds are that the thylacine cannot coexist with any Canis species, meaning that even if they were able to successfully breed and that inbreeding wouldn't be a problem, they'd still likely be outcompeted by the 1950s and would almost certainly not survive till modern day. And as far as we know, the thylacine would end up going extinct in 1936. Though there is still some evidence that the thylacine could persist on till this day, though this possibility remains to be confirmed, and right now cloning efforts are on their way to possibly bring back this amazing animal. The thylacine is unique for so many reasons, from its incredibly wide opening jaw, to its backwards facing pouch which both males and females would carry, and let's just face it, it's adorable. So personally, whether it's still alive today in North America, New Guinea, mainland Australia, or Tasmania, I just want to see the thylacine again. And hopefully with these future cloning efforts allegedly bringing the thylacine back, and the possibility of the thylacine being rediscovered in multiple different areas across the world, there is hope that we could one day all see this creature again in the flesh. And before I go, I want to give a huge thanks to Forrest Galante for bringing this incredibly unlikely but also incredibly fascinating story to my attention. And I also want to thank all of you guys. I have 8,000 subscribers now. That's insane, and I couldn't be more thankful. So please enjoy your holidays, and I'll try to get one more video out before the year ends. Goodbye.